In the autumn of 1957, Professor Henri Dubois of the University of Lyon made a discovery that would haunt him until his death 9 years later. While researching 18th-century folklore manuscripts in the basement archives of the Bibliothèque Municipale de Villeneuve-sur-Lot, he uncovered a collection of documents that challenged everything scholars believed about one of France's most beloved fairy tales. The papers, bound in cracked leather and bearing the faded seal of the Beaumont family estate, contained correspondence, diary entries, and witness testimonies that painted a darker picture behind the story of Beauty and the Beast. The documents suggested that Jeanne-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont, the governess who published the famous tale in 1756, had based her story on real events that occurred in the Dordogne region during the harsh winter of 1754. According to the papers, a young woman named Isabelle Moreau had indeed lived in isolation with a mysterious figure in a decaying chateau deep in the Périgord forest. But the truth, as recorded by witnesses of that time, bore little resemblance to the romantic tale that would later enchant children across Europe. The first document Professor Dubois examined was a letter dated March 15, 1755, written by Father Auguste Clément, the parish priest of Saint-Cyprien. In his correspondence to the Bishop of Périgueux, Father Clément described his growing concern about reports from local villagers regarding strange occurrences at the abandoned Château de Malmont. The priest wrote of unexplained sounds echoing through the forest at night, of livestock found dead with no apparent cause, and of a young woman glimpsed walking the chateau grounds at dawn, always alone, always silent. The chateau itself had stood empty for nearly 2 decades before these events. Built in the 17th century by the nobleman Armand de Malmont, it had been abandoned after a fire claimed the lives of 3 family members in 1736. Local records indicated that Armand's son, Philippe de Malmont, had survived but suffered severe disfigurement in the blaze. He disappeared shortly after, and the property was left to decay. The villagers of Saint-Cyprien had long avoided the area, claiming the building was cursed, though none could articulate exactly why. In his letter, Father Clément mentioned that several parishioners had reported seeing smoke rising from the chateau's chimneys during the winter months of 1754. When he finally decided to investigate in early 1755, he discovered signs of recent habitation, cleared pathways, repaired shutters, and a small garden that had been recently tended. Most disturbing to the priest was the discovery of women's clothing hanging on a line in the chateau's inner courtyard, garments that appeared to belong to someone young and well-born. The second document that captured Professor Dubois' attention was a series of diary entries written in a feminine hand, dated between November 1754 and February 1755. The writing belonged to someone identifying herself only as I.M. The entries began normally enough, describing daily routines of reading, needlework, and tending to household tasks. But as the winter progressed, the tone grew increasingly strained and fearful. In her entry for December 5, 1754, I.M. wrote of her growing unease with her situation. "He provides well for my needs, yet I find myself longing for the sound of another human voice. The silence here weighs upon me like a shroud." When I asked about visiting the village, he grew agitated and spoke of dangers that I could not understand. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps it is safer here, away from the world. By January, the entries revealed a young woman in psychological distress. She described hearing footsteps in empty corridors, finding doors that she was certain she had left open, now firmly shut, and discovering personal items moved to different locations. Most unsettling were her accounts of conversations with her mysterious benefactor, whom she never named directly, but referred to only as he or my protector. According to I.M. the Dabber's diary, this man claimed to have known her family and to have made promises to her father before his death. She wrote that he insisted her presence at the chateau was temporary, that arrangements were being made for her proper settlement in society. But months passed without any sign of these promised arrangements materializing. Instead, I.M. found herself increasingly isolated, dependent on her host for all necessities, and growing more fearful of the world beyond the chateau walls. The third document, a testimony given to the local magistrate by a travelling merchant named Claude Besson, provided an outside perspective on the situation at Château de Malmont. Besson claimed that in late February of 1755, while seeking shelter from a sudden storm, he had approached the chateau and encountered a young woman in the courtyard. According to his sworn statement, the woman appeared frightened and malnourished, with bruises on her arms that she attempted to conceal beneath her sleeves. Besson described how the woman begged him to carry a message to her relatives in the nearby town of Bergerac. She pressed a small piece of paper into his hand, but before he could examine it, a tall figure emerged from the chateau. The man, whose face was partially concealed by shadows and what appeared to be deliberate scarring, ordered Besson to leave immediately. The merchant complied, but later discovered that the paper contained only the words, "Help me," written in a trembling hand. When Besson attempted to return to the chateau the following day, with assistance from local authorities, they found the building completely empty. There were signs of hasty departure, cold ashes in the fireplace, a meal left half-eaten on the table, and personal belongings scattered throughout the rooms. Most disturbing was the discovery of women's clothing in one of the upper chambers, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. The investigation that followed yielded few concrete answers. The local constabulary, led by Captain Georges Roussel, conducted a thorough search of the chateau and surrounding grounds. They found evidence of recent habitation, but no clear indication of violence or foul play. The bloodstains on the clothing proved to be old and could have resulted from any number of minor injuries. Without a body or clear evidence of a crime, the authorities could do little more than file a report and continue monitoring the area. Captain Roussel's official report, included among Professor Dubois' documents, noted several peculiarities about the chateau itself. During their search, the investigators discovered that several rooms had been modified in ways that suggested long-term imprisonment or confinement. Windows had been barred from the outside, locks had been installed on bedroom doors that could only be operated from the corridor, and a series of passages had been blocked off, effectively limiting movement through the building to a few specific areas. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery of a hidden chamber behind the chateau's library. This room, accessible only through a concealed panel, contained what appeared to be personal effects belonging to multiple young women, spanning several decades. Among the items were pieces of jewelry, locks of hair tied with ribbon, and small portraits. Each collection was carefully labelled with initials and dates, the earliest going back to 1738, just 2 years after the fire that had supposedly driven the chateau's inhabitants away. The investigation also uncovered correspondence between Philippe de Malmont and various individuals across France. Letters that suggested a pattern of contact with families who had daughters in need of protection or suitable placement. These families, often recently bereaved or facing financial difficulties, had apparently entrusted their daughters to de Malmont's care, believing him to be arranging appropriate marriages or positions in respectable households. Dr. Marie Fontaine, a physician who examined the recovered personal effects, noted in her report that several of the hair samples showed evidence of having been cut rather than naturally shed. The portraits, while difficult to date precisely, appeared to span approximately 20 years and depicted young women of similar age and social standing. All appeared well-dressed and healthy at the time the portraits were created, which made their ultimate fate all the more troubling. The search for Isabelle Moreau, whom investigators believe to be the identity behind the initials IM, led authorities to the town of Bergerac, where they discovered that her family had indeed perished in a plague outbreak during the summer of 1754. Isabel, then 18 years old, had been left orphaned and with limited means. According to neighbors, she had received an offer of employment from a gentleman who claimed to represent a noble family in need of a companion for their daughter. The family's former priest, Father Nicolas Beaumont, confirmed that he had recommended Isabel for the position, believing it to be legitimate. Father Beaumont admitted that he had been contacted by letter from someone claiming to be Philippe de Malmont, who presented himself as a reformed man, seeking to perform acts of charity in atonement for past sins. The priest, familiar with the de Malmont family's reputation before the fire, had seen no reason to doubt the man's sincerity. This revelation led investigators to examine parish records across the region, searching for other young women who might have disappeared under similar circumstances. Their research revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the course of nearly 20 years, at least 12 young women from various parishes had been reported missing after accepting positions or arrangements made through intermediaries claiming connections to noble families. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid detection by any single authority. The women came from different towns, their disappearances were spaced months or sometimes years apart, and the circumstances always appeared legitimate to local clergy and magistrates. Philippe de Malmont, if indeed he was the man responsible, had clearly learned to operate within the gaps of an administrative system that relied heavily on personal reputation and written recommendations. As the investigation expanded, authorities began to uncover evidence of de Malmont's movements over the past 2 decades. Property records showed that he had maintained not just the family chateau, but also several smaller properties throughout the Dordogne region. These locations, isolated farmhouses and hunting lodges, had been purchased or leased under various names, but could be connected to de Malmont through financial records discovered in the chateau's hidden chamber. Each of these properties showed signs of having been prepared for long-term habitation by someone other than de Malmont himself. Bedrooms had been furnished with women's clothing and personal items. Libraries had been stocked with books considered appropriate for young ladies' education, and kitchens had been supplied with provisions for extended periods of isolation. The impression was of carefully prepared stages in some elaborate and sinister theatre. The psychological aspect of de Malmont's apparent method became clearer as investigators pieced together testimonies from servants and tradespeople who had interacted with him over the years. Those who remembered him described a man who could be charming and cultured when it suited his purposes, but who seemed to harbor an obsessive need for control over every aspect of his environment. Several witnesses mentioned his habit of speaking about the young women in his care as if they were beloved children or cherished pets rather than independent human beings. A particularly disturbing account came from Marie Dubois, a seamstress from Sarlat, who had been commissioned to create clothing for de Malmont's ward during the winter of 1753. According to Marie, de Malmont had been extremely specific about the measurements and style of garments, insisting on designs that would be beautiful but impractical for travel or outdoor activity. He had also requested that all clothing be created in a distinctive deep blue fabric, claiming it was his ward's favorite color. Marie's testimony suggested that de Malmont viewed his captives as objects to be displayed and admired rather than as human beings with their own desires or agency. This interpretation was supported by other evidence found at the chateau, including detailed sketches of interior decorations and furniture arrangements that seemed designed to create picturesque tableaux featuring young women in various domestic poses. The investigation reached a crucial turning point when authorities discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath loose floorboards in de Malmont's private study. These letters, written in multiple feminine hands, painted a horrifying picture of systematic psychological manipulation and gradual erosion of hope. The women wrote of increasing isolation, of punishment for attempts to communicate with the outside world, and of growing fear that they would never see their families again. One letter, written by someone identifying herself as Catherine B. and dated September 17, 52, described her realization that she was not the first young woman to occupy her chambers. "I have found scratches in the window frame that form letters spelling out names. Marie, Suzanne, Elizabeth. How many have passed through this room before me? And where did they go when he tired of their presence?" Another letter revealed the extent of de Malmont's deception regarding the outside world. The writer, Sophie R., described how he had shown her newspapers containing reports of plague and civil unrest, claiming that her family had perished and that returning to society would mean certain death. Only later did she discover that the newspapers were several years old and that the events described had occurred long before her arrival at the chateau. Perhaps most chilling was a letter fragment found in the chateau's fireplace, partially burned but still legible. The unknown writer described an attempt to escape that had ended in recapture and what she euphemistically termed lessons in gratitude. The letter suggested that de Malmont's methods of control went far beyond psychological manipulation, though the exact nature of his punishments was left deliberately vague. The fate of Isabelle Moreau and the other missing women remained unclear even as the investigation continued through the spring of 1755. Searches of the chateau grounds and surrounding forest yielded no human remains, leading some to hope that the women had simply been relocated to other properties. However, the discovery of personal effects spanning 20 years suggested a more sinister conclusion. In June of 1755, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a former servant of the de Malmont family came forward with additional information. Jean Calvière, who had worked as a groundskeeper at the chateau before the fire of 1736, revealed that Philippe de Malmont's psychological problems predated his physical disfigurement. According to Calvière, the young nobleman had displayed disturbing behaviors toward female servants even before the fire, leading to several unexplained departures and complaints that were quietly suppressed by his father. Calvière's testimony suggested that the fire itself might not have been the accident it appeared to be. He described Philippe's obsession with controlling every aspect of the chateau's domestic life and his violent reactions to any disruption of his carefully ordered routines. The groundskeeper believed that Philippe had deliberately set the fire during a confrontation with family members who had discovered his treatment of the household staff. This revelation prompted authorities to re-examine the original investigation into the chateau fire. The records stored in the archives of the local constabulary revealed several inconsistencies that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored at the time. Witness statements had been altered, evidence had disappeared, and key testimonies had been sealed by order of Philippe's father, who possessed considerable influence with local officials. The pattern that emerged suggested a systematic cover-up designed to protect the de Malmont family name and allow Philippe to escape consequences for his actions. His supposed death in the fire had been a convenient fiction that permitted him to assume a new identity while continuing to operate from the shadows. The disfigurement he was known to display in later years might well have been self-inflicted as part of this elaborate deception. As summer turned to autumn in 1755, the investigation began to encounter obstacles that suggested powerful interests were working to suppress further discoveries. Key witnesses recanted their testimonies, documents disappeared from official files, and several investigators were reassigned to other duties without explanation. Captain Roussel, who had led the initial search of the chateau, was found dead in his home in November, apparently the victim of a sudden illness that left no visible symptoms. The official conclusion of the investigation, released in December 1755, stated that while evidence suggested possible wrongdoing at Château de Malmont, insufficient proof existed to pursue criminal charges against any specific individual. Philippe de Malmont was declared legally dead, the chateau was sealed by order of the regional authority, and all related documents were classified as sensitive materials requiring special permission for access. Father Clement, whose initial letter had sparked the investigation, was transferred to a remote parish in the mountains near the Spanish border. Before his departure, he managed to preserve copies of key documents from the case, hiding them among routine ecclesiastical records where they would remain undiscovered for 2 centuries. It was these copies that Professor Dubois would eventually uncover in 1957. The connection between these real events and the fairy tale published by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont became clear when Professor Dubois discovered a final document, a letter from Madame de Beaumont to her publisher, dated August 19, 1756. In this letter, she explained her decision to create a romanticized version of events she had learned about through her connections to the French aristocracy. Madame de Beaumont wrote that she had been deeply disturbed by the true story, but recognized its potential as a cautionary tale about the dangers young women faced in a society that offered them few protections. By transforming Philippe de Malmont into a cursed but ultimately redeemable beast, and by giving Isabelle Moreau the agency to break the spell through love and virtue, she hoped to provide young readers with both entertainment and a subtle warning about predatory behavior disguised as benevolence. The governess acknowledged in her letter that the real Isabelle Moreau had possessed the courage and intelligence to escape her captor, but that her ultimate fate remained unknown. Madame de Beaumont expressed her hope that by immortalizing the young woman as Belle in her fairy tale, she was ensuring that Isabelle's story would serve to educate future generations about the importance of questioning situations that seemed too good to be true. Professor Dubois spent the remaining years of his career attempting to trace the connections between the de Malmont case and other disappearances throughout 18th century France. His research suggested that Philippe de Malmont might have been part of a larger network of individuals who preyed upon vulnerable young women, using their social positions and connections to operate with impunity across multiple regions. The professor's work was cut short by his death in 1966, officially attributed to heart failure, but occurring under circumstances that his colleagues found suspicious. His research notes were confiscated by unknown authorities shortly after his funeral, and his published papers on the subject were quietly withdrawn from academic circulation. The original documents he had discovered in Villeneuve-sur-Lot disappeared during a routine archive reorganization and have never been relocated. Today, tourists who visit the Dordogne region can still see the ruins of Château de Malmont, though access to the building itself remains restricted. Local guides rarely mention the structure's history, and official tourism materials describe it only as an example of 17th century noble architecture damaged by fire. The basement chambers, where evidence of Philippe de Malmont's activities was found, have been sealed with concrete, ostensibly for safety reasons. The village of Saint-Cyprien maintains no memorial to Isabelle Moreau or the other young women who disappeared during the 18th century. Parish records from that period remain classified, and requests for access are routinely denied. The church where Father Clement once served has been converted to secular use, its ecclesiastical archives transferred to an unknown location. In the nearby town of Bergerac, the house where Isabelle Moreau spent her childhood still stands, now occupied by a family unaware of their home's connection to one of France's darkest fairy tales. The well in the courtyard, where she once drew water, is filled with earth, and the room where she slept has been subdivided into storage space. No plaque marks her residence there. No monument acknowledges her existence. The fairy tale of Beauty and the Beast continues to enchant children around the world, its message of love conquering fear and goodness, triumphing over evil, providing comfort to countless families. Few who enjoy the story realize that its origins lie in a case of systematic predation and murder that authorities chose to suppress rather than solve. The real Belle never found her happy ending, never escaped her captor's control, never lived to see justice done. Sometimes, late in the evening, when mist rises from the Dordogne River and settles among the ruins of Château de Malmont, local residents report hearing sounds that cannot be explained by wind or wildlife. They describe voices calling out in distress, footsteps echoing through empty corridors, and the sound of doors closing softly in buildings that no longer have doors to close. The authorities dismiss these reports as imagination or tourist fabrication, but the sounds continue nonetheless. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Municipale de Villeneuve-sur-Lot, a new librarian occasionally discovers documents that were not there the day before. Letters written in feminine hands, diary entries describing fear and isolation, testimonies of witnesses long dead. These papers are quickly removed and filed away in sections that require special authorization to access. The authorization is never granted, and in academic circles throughout Europe, scholars who attempt to research the true origins of French fairy tales find their work mysteriously hampered by missing documents, closed archives, and funding that disappears without explanation. Some subjects, it seems, are too dangerous to examine too closely, even after more than 2 centuries have passed. The story of Isabelle Moreau and Philippe de Malmont serves as a reminder that the most horrifying monsters are often those who wear human faces, who speak in cultured voices, who operate within the boundaries of respectable society. The real beast of this tale was never cursed by magic or transformed by love. He was simply a man who discovered how easy it was to prey upon the vulnerable when those in power preferred ignorance to justice. Perhaps that is why the fairy tale version became so beloved. It offers a world where monsters can be redeemed, where virtue is rewarded, where young women possess the power to transform their circumstances through courage and love. Reality, as the hidden documents of the de Malmont case demonstrate, is far less forgiving. In the real world, some beasts remain beasts, some prisons have no keys, and some stories end not with weddings, but with silence that stretches on for centuries. The children who listen to Beauty and the Beast at bedtime, safe in their warm homes, surrounded by people who love them, cannot know that they are hearing the echoes of a tragedy that authorities worked carefully to erase. They cannot know that the beautiful story was born from ugly truth, that the happy ending was a gift denied to the young woman who inspired it. They sleep peacefully, trusting in the fairy tale's promise that good will always triumph over evil. But in the forests of the Dordogne, where shadows gather thickest among the ancient oaks and the wind carries voices from times long past, a different truth persists. There, the real story continues, whispered by spirits that justice forgot, carried by winds that remember when no one else will. And so the tale of Beauty and the Beast endures, its dark origins buried beneath centuries of retelling. Its true victim, forgotten by all but the wind that still moves through the ruins of Château de Malmont. Isabelle Moreau's name appears in no official records, her fate acknowledged by no monument, her courage recognized by no history book. The documents that Professor Henri Dubois discovered in 1957 have vanished as completely as their subjects, consumed by the same silence that swallowed Philippe de Malmont and his victims. The basement archives of the Bibliothèque Municipale de Villeneuve-sur-Lot contain only empty spaces where those leather-bound papers once rested, gaps in the collection that librarians are instructed never to explain. In 1968, the final witness to these events passed away. Marie Calvière, daughter of the groundskeeper Jean Calvière, died in a nursing home outside Bordeaux, taking with her the last first-hand accounts of the de Malmont family's true nature. Her personal effects included a small wooden box containing locks of hair and a faded portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Items she claimed belonged to her father's favorite among the chateau's many victims. The box disappeared during the settlement of Marie's estate, removed by officials who claimed it contained materials relevant to ongoing governmental investigations. No such investigations were ever publicly acknowledged. The nursing home's records of Marie's final days were sealed, and the staff who cared for her were transferred to other facilities across France. Today, the fairy tale continues its journey through time, adapted into films and ballets, retold in countless children's books, transformed into animated features that bring joy to new generations. Each retelling moves further from the truth, adding magic where there was only manipulation, inserting hope where there was only horror. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, children who have heard the story of Beauty and the Beast report dreams of a young woman calling out from behind locked doors, of roses that smell like tears, of beasts that speak with human voices but possess no human hearts. These dreams fade with morning light, dismissed as imagination by parents who themselves once dreamed similar dreams and learned to forget them. The real Belle never escaped her tower, never broke her captor's spell, never lived to tell her own story. She exists now only in whispers carried by wind through abandoned ruins, in shadows that move through empty rooms, in the rustle of pages turning in books that no one reads anymore, and in the Dordogne, where the mist still rises on autumn evenings and the forests still hold their secrets close. The truth waits patiently for someone brave enough to listen, to remember, to speak the names that power worked so hard to silence. Until then, the fairy tale continues. Beautiful and beloved and utterly false, a story that ends with happily ever after, built upon the bones of those who never lived to see another dawn. The real story has no such ending. It simply continues, like the wind, like the shadows, like the sound of doors that close forever, on voices calling out for help that will never come.